The photograph had survived longer than anyone expected. Taken in 1895, it showed a young girl standing on a cobbled street, boots neatly aligned, an umbrella tilted just enough to suggest playfulness rather than rain. She looked happy in the uncomplicated way happiness used to be captured, still, obedient, and meant to last forever. Archivists admired the balance of light and shadow, the way her smile seemed to soften the stiff formality of the era. For decades, the image was reproduced in books and exhibitions as an example of rare optimism from a time otherwise obsessed with solemnity. When the restoration began, no one anticipated resistance. The process was routine: clean the scratches, stabilize the contrast, recover what time had gently erased. But as the software peeled away layers of age, the photograph began to feel less cooperative, as if it were withholding something. The umbrella darkened unnaturally, absorbing detail instead of releasing it. The girl's eyes, once bright, appeared fixed, focused past the lens, past the viewer, toward a presence that no longer existed in the frame. Then the first anomaly appeared. Beneath the umbrella's edge, where shadow should have remained empty, a shape emerged with too much intention to be a flaw. Small fingers, too small to belong to the girl, curled inward, tense as though gripping the moment itself. The room fell quiet as technicians stared, replaying the restoration step by step, hoping the image would correct itself. It didn't. As clarity increased, the smile began to change. What once felt cheerful now seemed practiced, held in place against something heavier. Faint lines traced her cheeks, marks not of age or damage, but of something wiped away carefully, deliberately. The photograph had not preserved happiness after all. It had concealed it, sealing grief beneath silver and paper, waiting patiently for someone to look closely enough to lose it all over again. When the photograph first surfaced in the municipal archive, it arrived without drama, folded into the quiet anonymity of thousands of glass plate negatives from the late 19th century. The label was plain, written in fading ink by a clerk whose only task had been to record, not to interpret. Street Portrait 1895. Nothing about it demanded attention. It showed a young girl standing alone on a narrow cobbled road, holding an umbrella that looked slightly too large for her small hands. Her dress was neat, her hair carefully arranged, and her posture carried the unmistakable stiffness of early photography, when subjects were trained to hold still as statues. Yet there was something about her expression that softened the severity of the era. She was smiling, not broadly, but enough to suggest a private delight, a moment of childish patience rewarded by the novelty of being photographed. To the archivists, this was what made the image special. Most photographs from that period carried a weight of solemnity, as if joy itself had been an inconvenience to the long exposure times and rigid social expectations. Children rarely smiled, adults almost never did. This girl, however, seemed to exist outside that rule. Her eyes were open and alert, her lips curved gently upward, and the umbrella tilted at an angle that felt intentional rather than accidental, as though she had been allowed a small degree of play. In exhibitions, the image was often described as disarmingly warm or unexpectedly cheerful, praised for capturing an intimacy that most 19th century portraits lacked. Scholars pointed to the technical quality of the photograph as further evidence of its value. The lighting was unusually even, the background softly blurred in a way that drew focus to the girl without erasing her surroundings. The cobblestones beneath her feet were sharp enough to count, and the umbrella's ribs formed a delicate pattern above her head. For an image produced with the limitations of the time, it felt remarkably balanced, as if the photographer had possessed an instinctive understanding of composition that transcended the mechanical nature of the medium. Some speculated that the photographer might have been a traveling professional, someone who knew how to coax comfort from his subjects rather than intimidation. Because nothing in the photograph appeared overtly remarkable, it became safe. Safe images are the ones most easily loved, the ones that slide neatly into narratives people already believe about the past. This photograph reinforced the comforting idea that even in harsher times, there were moments of innocence untouched by tragedy. The girl became a symbol rather than a person, a visual reassurance that happiness had always existed, quietly and persistently, even when history suggested otherwise. Reproductions of the image appeared in textbooks, postcards, and museum gift shops, each iteration further flattening her into an emblem of uncomplicated childhood. No one asked who she was. The absence of a name was not unusual. Many photographs from the period had lost their personal details to time. It was enough, people thought, to know when she lived. The year 1895 anchored her safely in the past, far enough away to feel resolved, finished, incapable of changing. The umbrella became a charming prop rather than a deliberate choice. The street behind her was treated as a generic backdrop, interchangeable with any other cobbled lane from the era. Context was unnecessary when the image itself seemed to explain everything it needed to. This initial interpretation was reinforced by repetition. The more the photograph was described as happy, the more that happiness hardened into fact. Curators used language that guided the viewer gently but firmly toward a specific emotional response, encouraging admiration rather than inquiry. Visitors lingered on the smile, on the novelty of seeing a child from the 19th century who looked so familiar, so approachable. It became easy to project modern assumptions onto her face, to imagine laughter just before or after the shutter clicked, to assume loving parents waiting nearby, watching proudly as she stood still. For the camera, even the umbrella contributed to this illusion. In later commentaries, it was often framed as a playful accessory, oversized in a way that made the girl appear smaller and therefore cuter. Some suggested it might have been a gift or a borrowed object meant to keep her entertained during the long exposure. The idea that it could have served any other purpose never surfaced, because the photograph as it was first seen did not invite such questions. It presented a complete and satisfying story at a glance, and completeness discourages curiosity. By the time the decision was made to digitally restore the photograph, it was already burdened with decades of assumption. Restoration was proposed not as an act of discovery, but as preservation, a way to protect what everyone believed they already understood. The goal was to enhance clarity, to remove the superficial damage caused by age, and to ensure that future generations could continue to see the image as it had always been seen. There was no expectation that restoration might alter meaning, only that it would reinforce the existing one. In this way, the photograph's apparent happiness was not merely observed, but constructed, shaped by professional language, institutional habits, and the human desire for simple narratives. It became a fixed point of reassurance within the archive, a quiet favorite that required no emotional risk to appreciate. The girl with the umbrella stood frozen in a moment everyone agreed was gentle and complete, her smile accepted as truth rather than examined as expression, her stillness mistaken for peace, her silence interpreted as contentment, her presence treated as evidence that nothing more needed to be seen. The restoration began as a technical exercise, methodical and detached, guided by software presets and the steady habits of conservators who had spent years coaxing clarity from damaged images. The glass plate was scanned at a resolution far beyond what the human eye could comfortably process. Each microscopic flaw rendered visible, each imperfection mapped like a landscape. At first, the changes were reassuringly ordinary. Scratches softened, dust motes dissolved, and the tonal range expanded so that the cobblestones appeared more dimensional, the folds in the girl's dress more deliberate. The photograph seemed to breathe, regaining a depth that age had flattened, and the umbrella's dark canopy grew richer, its surface absorbing light in a way that suggested texture rather than emptiness. It was during this stage that the first inconsistency appeared, subtle enough to be dismissed if anyone had been inclined to rush. Beneath the umbrella, where shadow pooled thickest, the darkness behaved strangely. Instead of thinning as contrast adjustments were applied, it condensed, forming a patch that resisted illumination. Technicians assumed it was a chemical artifact, a quirk of the original emulsion reacting unevenly to time. Such anomalies were common, especially in images exposed outdoors where light conditions had been unpredictable. The instinct was to smooth it out, to correct the imbalance and return the photograph to visual harmony. But the more they worked, the more the shadow refused to cooperate. Algorithms designed to recover lost detail began to outline something within the darkness, not sharply at first, but with a persistence that felt intentional. It was not random noise, nor the branching fractures typical of deteriorating plates. The shape had edges, curves, a suggestion of structure that made the technicians slow their hands and recheck their settings. Each incremental adjustment pulled the shape closer to legibility, as if the image itself were responding to attention, offering just enough information to keep them engaged. When the form finally crossed the threshold from abstraction to recognition, the room fell silent. Emerging from beneath the umbrella's edge was the outline of a small hand. The fingers were curled inward, their proportions unmistakably childlike, yet they did not match the girl's posture. They were positioned too high, too close to the fabric, gripping rather than holding. The hand appeared to be inside the umbrella, pressing outward, creating a tension in the cloth that had previously been read as a simple fold or shadow. The immediate reaction was disbelief. Restoration teams are trained to distrust first impressions, to assume error before revelation. Multiple scans were compared, different enhancement techniques applied, each intended to disprove what the eye insisted on seeing. Yet every method returned the same result. The hand did not dissolve under scrutiny, it sharpened. Fine details emerged. The suggestion of knuckles, the uneven spacing of the fingers, the way the smallest finger bent slightly away from the others. These were not qualities produced by chance or decay. They belonged to something that had been there all along. As the technicians replayed the restoration process frame by frame, it became clear that the hand had always existed within the photograph, hidden by the limitations of earlier viewing methods. On the original print, the umbrella's interior was a solid mass of black, an absence rather than a space. Only with the modern ability to separate layers of tone did the image surrender what it had concealed. This realization shifted the atmosphere in the room. What had begun as routine preservation now felt like intrusion, as though they had uncovered something private, something deliberately obscured. Questions surfaced immediately, but none of them had satisfying answers. Whose hand was it? The size suggested another child, smaller than the girl but not by much. The positioning implied closeness, an intimacy that contradicted the solitary framing of the portrait. If another child had been present, why were they hidden? Why position them beneath the umbrella, out of view of the camera, rather than beside the girl where they could be clearly seen? The photograph, once praised for its simplicity, now bristled with complications. The hand also altered the emotional reading of the image in ways that were difficult to articulate. What had been interpreted as a playful tilt of the umbrella now felt purposeful, even protective. The girl's grip on the handle appeared firmer, her stance more grounded, as though she were bracing herself rather than posing casually. The umbrella ceased to be an accessory and became a barrier, a deliberate obstruction placed between the camera and whatever lay beneath it. This reframing unsettled the technicians, not because it introduced overt horror, but because it suggested intention and awareness. Further enhancement revealed subtle distortions in the umbrella's fabric, areas where the cloth stretched unnaturally, as if pulled from the inside. These distortions aligned with the position of the hand, reinforcing the impression of physical presence rather than visual artifact. The image no longer felt static. It suggested pressure, contact, a moment caught mid-action, rather than a simple freeze of time. The stillness that had once been read as calm now felt strained, held in place by effort rather than ease. Attempts to rationalize the discovery multiplied. Some proposed that the hand could belong to the girl herself, caught at an odd angle by the long exposure. But this theory collapsed under closer examination. The orientation was wrong, the proportions inconsistent. Others suggested double exposure, a common flaw in early photography, but the clarity and integration of the hand into the scene argued against it. There was no ghosting, no transparency, no visual echo that typically accompanied such mistakes. The hand was solid, anchored, undeniably part of the moment the shutter had captured. As the reality of the discovery settled in, a new unease replaced the initial shock. The photograph had not lied exactly. It had simply allowed itself to be misunderstood. The umbrella, once a symbol of innocence, now read as concealment. The smile, once interpreted as carefree, began to feel rehearsed, as if it were meant to distract from what could not be shown. The restoration had not added anything to the image. It had only removed the comfort of ignorance. From that point on, it was impossible to view the photograph as a solitary portrait. The presence beneath the umbrella demanded acknowledgement, transforming the image into a record of a relationship rather than an individual. Yet the absence of any visible body, any face to attach to the hand, made that relationship feel incomplete, unresolved. The hand existed in a liminal state, neither fully hidden nor fully revealed, gripping the umbrella as though it were the only thing keeping it anchored to the world, a fragment of a story that refused to remain buried but would not yet allow itself to be fully told. Once the presence beneath the umbrella had been acknowledged, attention returned inevitably to the girl herself. The restoration team found it impossible to look at her face the way they had before, as if the discovery of the hidden hand had recalibrated their vision. Subtle adjustments were made to the image not to hunt for further anomalies, but to better understand her expression now that the context had shifted. The software enhanced micro contrasts around her eyes and mouth, clarifying contours that earlier restorations had treated as incidental. What emerged was not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet reorientation of meaning that felt more unsettling than any obvious distortion. Her smile, which had once seemed directed toward the camera, no longer aligned with the lens when measured precisely. The corners of her mouth angled slightly away, creating a faint asymmetry that earlier viewers had interpreted as charm. Now, it appeared intentional. Her gaze, too, refused to meet the viewers. When the line of sight was traced using reference points in the image, it became clear that she was looking past the camera towards something positioned lower and closer than a standing adult would be. This realization introduced a new tension into the frame, one that suggested interaction rather than performance. The longer the team studied her eyes, the more difficult it became to read them as carefree. There was an alertness there that did not match the relaxed posture of a posed portrait. Her eyelids were slightly raised, as if she were monitoring something just beyond the edge of the photograph, something that required attention. This alertness did not resemble fear in the conventional sense, but it did not resemble joy either. It existed somewhere in between, a watchfulness that implied responsibility. The girl was not merely being photographed. She was actively aware of her surroundings in a way that felt disproportionate to the simplicity of the scene. As clarity increased, the spatial relationship between the girl and the hidden presence beneath the umbrella became more apparent. The angle of her shoulders suggested she was subtly turned inward, creating a pocket of space beneath the canopy. Her hand on the umbrella's handle was firm, the knuckles faintly pronounced, indicating tension rather than casual grip. This posture, once dismissed as the stiffness required by early photographic techniques, now appeared purposeful, as though she were anchoring herself to the object that concealed the other child. The photograph began to read less like a portrait and more like a moment of quiet coordination. This shift in interpretation altered the emotional weight of her smile. It no longer felt like an expression meant to communicate happiness, but like one designed to fulfill expectation. In the late 19th century, children were often coached to appear pleasant and composed, but the nuance here suggested something more specific. The smile seemed to function as a signal, a way to satisfy the photographer and end the exposure without inviting further scrutiny. It was a smile that asked for nothing, offered nothing, and yet worked very hard to exist. Further enhancement revealed fine details along her cheeks that earlier restorations had softened away. These faint lines, barely visible even at high resolution, traced downward from the corners of her eyes. They were not deep enough to be scars, nor irregular enough to be damage. Their placement and symmetry suggested they were remnants of moisture, once wiped or dried before the photograph was taken. The implication was subtle but difficult to ignore. The girl may not have been smiling because she was happy, but because she had recently been upset and was expected to appear otherwise. The idea that she might be performing composure reframed the entire image. The street behind her, previously seen as a neutral backdrop, now felt exposed and indifferent, a public space in which private emotion had to be suppressed. The photographer's unseen presence took on new significance, not as a benign documentarian, but as an authority figure whose expectations shaped the moment. The girl's gaze, angled just off frame, seemed to acknowledge something the photographer could not see or chose not to see. As the team experimented with depth mapping, attempting to reconstruct the three-dimensional space implied by the photograph, they noticed that her line of sight converged with the position of the hidden hand beneath the umbrella. This alignment was not perfect, but it was close enough to suggest intention. She was not smiling at the camera, and she was not smiling at an imagined audience. She was smiling toward the presence she was concealing, offering reassurance or instruction in a language that did not require words. The photograph had captured a private exchange and mistaken it for a public one. This interpretation introduced an uncomfortable intimacy into the viewing process. To look at the image now felt like eavesdropping on a moment that had not been meant for outsiders. The girl's expression carried the weight of someone trying to maintain control in a situation that threatened to unravel. Her composure became an act of care, a way to protect someone more vulnerable than herself. The umbrella, her posture, and her redirected smile all worked together to create a fragile equilibrium. The realization that her happiness might be misread did not immediately point to tragedy, but it dissolved the certainty that had once surrounded the photograph. Innocence, which had been so readily assigned to her, now felt complicated, layered with obligation and restraint. The image no longer offered comfort. Instead, it presented a question about what had been required of her in that moment, and why that requirement had gone unnoticed for so long. As the restoration team stepped back from the screen, they understood that the photograph's most profound deception had not been the hidden hand, but the assumption that expressions are always what they appear to be. The girl's smile, once celebrated as evidence of joy, now functioned as a veil, thin but effective, stretched carefully over a reality that the photograph had only partially allowed to surface. With the image now fractured by doubt, the next step felt inevitable. Visual evidence alone was no longer enough. The photograph demanded context, a place to belong beyond the archive drawer and the glow of restoration monitors. Researchers turned to municipal records from the year stamped on the negative, hoping to find even the faintest trace of the girl's identity. Census logs, property registries, school rolls, and tax documents were examined first, the usual sources that occasionally yielded a name or an address. But the street in the photograph resisted easy classification. Its cobblestones matched several neighborhoods, none conclusively. The absence that had once seemed unremarkable now felt deliberate, as though the photograph had been severed from its origins early on. Attention shifted to less formal records, the kinds that preserved whispers rather than facts. Parish archives became the next focus, their pages heavy with births, deaths, and marginal notes scribbled by overworked clerks. In these ledgers, patterns mattered more than precision. The researchers searched for gaps, for sudden changes in handwriting, for annotations squeezed between lines. It was there, amid baptisms and burials recorded with indifferent regularity, that something unusual surfaced. In the late summer of 1895, A brief note appeared beside a family entry, written smaller than the rest, as if added later. Child not presented. No name followed, no explanation, only a quiet deviation from routine. At first, this discovery seemed too thin to matter. Records from the period were full of inconsistencies, especially concerning children, whose lives were often documented only when they intersected with ritual or tragedy. Still, the timing was difficult to ignore. The entry corresponded with the same month scholars believed the photograph had been taken, based on clothing and light conditions. The family name attached to the note appeared nowhere else in the ledger that year, as if the line had been cut short. Digging deeper, the researchers cross-referenced this name with burial records, expecting to find an infant death that might explain the absence. None appeared. Instead, they found something more ambiguous, a burial listed simply as unidentified child, age approximated, cause of death left blank. Such entries were not unheard of, especially in poorer districts where families lacked the means or inclination to formalize loss. Yet the proximity of this burial to the parish note suggested a connection that could not be easily dismissed. Local newspapers from the same period offered little clarity, but they did contain hints. In a column dedicated to community notices, there was a brief mention of a disturbance reported by neighbors involving raised voices and a search conducted along the riverbank. The article was vague, stripped of names and outcomes, framed as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. No resolution followed in subsequent issues. The story simply vanished, crowded out by advertisements and reports deemed more important. What unsettled the researchers was not the absence of detail, but the pattern of omission. Each source taken alone could be explained away as incomplete. Together, they formed a negative space around an event that seemed to resist documentation. A child who should have appeared in records did not. A burial without identity stood in quiet contradiction to the meticulous accounting of adult lives. A public disturbance concluded without explanation. These fragments did not confirm a narrative, but they suggested one had existed and been allowed to dissolve. As the team assembled these findings, the photograph began to exert a strange gravity over the research. Details that once seemed irrelevant took on new meaning. The age of the girl, estimated from her height and dress, aligned closely with the age range implied by the burial record. The parish note's phrasing, "not presented," carried a troubling ambiguity. It could indicate illness, absence, or refusal. It could also indicate that someone had chosen not to bring a child forward, not to allow them to be seen. Whispers of local folklore added another layer, though the researchers approached these cautiously. In later oral histories collected decades after the fact, there were references to a family touched by misfortune, to a child who was kept close, and another who was sent away. Such phrases were imprecise, shaped by memory and superstition, but they echoed the same theme of concealment that now defined the photograph. The umbrella's shadow seemed to stretch into the archive itself, covering names, softening facts, blurring accountability. What disturbed the team most was how ordinary this pattern appeared. There was no dramatic record of violence, no official inquiry, no moral reckoning preserved in ink. If something had happened, it had been absorbed quietly into the machinery of daily life. The systems designed to record existence had done their job imperfectly, allowing one child to remain visible and another to fade into abstraction. The photograph, once thought to be a celebration, now looked like a rare moment when both presences had briefly occupied the same frame, one acknowledged, the other denied. As the research continued, it became clear that certainty would remain out of reach. Names might never align, dates might never resolve into a clean sequence. Yet the accumulation of partial truths carried its own weight. The photograph no longer floated freely in time. It was tethered to a cluster of absences that felt intentional rather than accidental. The girl's smile, the hidden hand, and the fractured archival trail converged on the same uneasy implication. that the image captured not just a moment of childhood, but a moment of decision, when visibility and invisibility were being negotiated in real time. In this light, the loss revealed by restoration was not confined to a single individual. It extended outward into the systems that had allowed such a loss to pass without record, without resolution. The photograph became a quiet indictment, not through accusation, but through endurance. It had survived where the truth around it had thinned, preserving a tension that official histories had failed to hold, waiting for a future capable of noticing what had been carefully, consistently left out. The final stage of restoration was approached with caution, not because the technology demanded it, but because the people involved no longer trusted what clarity might bring. Every previous enhancement had stripped away an assumption, replacing comfort with complication. And there was an unspoken awareness that the image had not yet finished revealing itself. The focus shifted to the girl's face, specifically the areas earlier processes had treated gently, smoothing transitions to preserve what was believed to be an expression of simple joy. This time, the goal was not preservation of appearance, but fidelity to what remained beneath decades of interpretation. As the software isolated micro-variations in tone along her cheeks, faint irregularities began to surface. At first, they appeared as nothing more than unevenness, the kind that often results from chemical aging or imperfect development. But when compared against known patterns of degradation, these marks behaved differently. They followed the natural contours of the face too precisely, curving downward in parallel paths from the corners of her eyes. They were not scratches, nor were they random stains. Their placement suggested intent, or at least origin, rooted in the living moment rather than the long decay that followed. The team adjusted the lighting simulation, recreating the angle of the original exposure as accurately as possible. Under this virtual light, the marks became more legible. They caught highlights in a way that implied a slight depression in the surface of the emulsion, as if something had once rested there long enough to alter it. The resemblance to tear tracks was impossible to ignore. Not fresh tears, glistening and dramatic, but the residue left behind after moisture had been wiped away, leaving faint traces that time had not fully erased. This discovery reframed the girl's expression once more, but this time the shift was deeply personal. Tears implied not just discomfort or tension, but emotion that had already occurred, something that preceded the photograph rather than unfolding within it. The image no longer represented a moment of feeling, but a moment after feeling, when composure had been reassembled and presented for documentation. The smile, already suspect, now read as something layered on top of grief, fragile and incomplete. What made this revelation particularly unsettling was its subtlety. The tear tracks were not obvious enough to provoke immediate concern, nor dramatic enough to demand explanation. They existed in a space that allowed them to be ignored, especially by viewers predisposed to see happiness. It became clear how easily they could have been missed, not just by earlier technology, but by human perception trained to prioritize certain narratives over others. The photograph had always contained this evidence. It had simply relied on expectation to keep it invisible. The implications rippled outward. If the girl had been crying shortly before the photograph was taken, the circumstances suggested by earlier discoveries gained new weight. The hidden hand beneath the umbrella, the redirected gaze, the guarded posture all aligned with the idea of recent distress. The photograph began to resemble an attempt at correction, a deliberate effort to overwrite an emotional truth with a socially acceptable image. In this context, the camera was not a passive observer, but a tool enlisted to enforce normalcy. The act of wiping away tears took on symbolic significance. Someone, whether the girl herself or an unseen adult, had intervened to remove visible signs of distress before the shutter was released. This gesture implied urgency and control, a desire to present a version of reality that excluded vulnerability. The faintness of the remaining tracks suggested haste rather than care, as if there had not been time to ensure complete erasure. The photograph captured the aftermath of that intervention, preserving both the attempt at concealment and its failure. As the team reviewed the fully restored image, the girl's face emerged as the most complex element of all. Her smile and her tears coexisted in quiet contradiction, each undermining the other. The smile no longer functioned as reassurance, instead it highlighted what it sought to replace. The tear tracks did not overwhelm the image, but they anchored it, preventing any return to the earlier reading of uncomplicated joy. The photograph now carried emotional depth that resisted simplification. This final revelation also altered the ethical relationship between viewer and subject. To see the tear tracks was to recognize that the photograph documented a moment of emotional compromise, when a child's inner state was subordinated to external expectation. The image ceased to be a charming artifact and became a record of endurance. The girl's stillness, once admired for its grace, now suggested compliance, an ability to suppress feeling in service of appearances. What emerged most powerfully was the sense of loss that extended beyond the implied disappearance of the second child. There was loss in the erasure of emotion, in the quiet agreement that sadness should not be recorded, especially when it complicates the story adults wish to tell. The photograph preserved that loss unintentionally, storing it in chemical traces too small to matter until someone chose to look closely enough. In its final restored form, the image no longer offered answers. Instead, it held contradictions in balance, refusing to resolve into a single truth. The girl stood as she always had, umbrella raised, smile in place, but now accompanied by evidence of what that posture had cost her. The restoration did not add tragedy to the photograph. It uncovered the traces of tragedy that had always been present, waiting patiently beneath the surface, aligned with the curve of her cheeks. Embedded in the moment where grief was briefly acknowledged and then asked to disappear,